Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Gordon Chang, political commentator and author of Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Gordon, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Well, thank you, Brittany.
I want to talk about a big development that we saw over the weekend in the United States' trade war with China. The two countries agreed to majorly roll back tariffs for 90 days as negotiations continue. So the triple-digit tariffs are on pause for now. But are you surprised at seemingly how well the conversations went between the United States and China and how much the tariffs dropped?
I was surprised that the agreement came so quickly, and I'm also surprised at the significant reduction in tariffs, 115 percentage points for both sides. That really puts us into a very different situation, and I think that that does pave the way for the discussions. Though I do think the discussions are going to be very difficult. The reason is that President Trump said that China has agreed to open its economy. That's something that the world has wanted for centuries. We thought we got that with the 2001 accession to the World Trade Organization by China. And we thought we had that with some other trade agreements, but we'll see. Trump is a master negotiator. He is willing to use American power. And so we might have a different result this time. But the forces of history are not working in favor of the American president.
I want to talk really quickly about the new tone rather, that both countries seem to be having, because both had really tough tones when it came to the other country. China essentially said, we're not coming to the table under duress. The United States had a tough tone by continuing to ratchet up those tariffs. According to NPR, a Chinese official described the meeting as candid, in-depth, and constructive, and the meeting marked, quote, substantial progress and reached important consensus. So, what do you think of that shift in tone and the fact that the tariffs from both sides were knocked down by triple digits?
Yeah, the tone from the U.S. side has certainly been conciliatory. Chinese officials speaking to the Chinese public after the agreement was announced still have pretty much the same language. And I think that's an indication. Xi Jinping for a half decade has made the argument to the Chinese people that China has surpassed the U.S. and that we're in terminal decline. So I think it's very difficult for them to talk about this. One topic in conversation in China that I think is of particular significance to the regime, and that is Americans' general tariff rate on Chinese goods is 30%, 3 times higher than the Chinese general tariffs on American goods at 10%. So there's been some explaining that Chinese propagandists have to do. And so I don't think we're going to really see too much of a change in the tone until there's a final agreement, if that occurs.
To that point, as you said earlier, both countries slashed tariffs by 115%, but China has tariffs now at 10%. The United States has them from 145% to 30%. So who emerged as the winner and loser, if there is one? Are both countries winners? What does that look like in your eyes?
Well, I think China came out ahead. And the reason is that our tariffs were remedies for the theft of intellectual property by China, and also China's increasingly predatory trade practices. So our tariffs came down a lot, but China is still continuing with the behavior that we abhor. So in a sense, China got that win. And the other thing that's important here is that tariffs were the way that the U.S. was keeping Chinese products out of the United States. But China, the way that China uses to keep American goods out of China is not so much the tariffs, but are the non-tariff barriers. And for the most part, those non-tariff barriers are still in place, which means that I think we're going to have a much harder time selling to China than China will have selling to the United States in this 90-day pause period. So that, again, is a win. Now, a lot of people are saying that President Trump caved into the Chinese. I don't actually think that's the case. I think that Trump let China have a win. And the reason is, as Trump talked about on Monday, the American tariffs were hurting the Chinese economy. He didn't want to see that distress. So he wanted to make sure that he had a good environment for coming to a comprehensive trade deal. So I think that it was basically Trump being magnanimous rather than him giving in to the specter of empty shelves or the prospect of inflation.
I know you don't think President Trump blinked. You said before in previous conversations that that could be a Jedi mind trick. He could be the art of the deal. When we're thinking of the negotiations that need to happen within this 90-day period of when the tariffs are largely paused, what do those need to look like? You said that those are going to be hard conversations. What do you think needs to be hammered out then?
Well, the reason why it's going to be so difficult is because, China has an economy that is geared to suppressing consumer demand. And it's because China believes, for one thing, Xi Jinping has put China on a war footing economy. Plus, also, he wants to support Chinese factories, and he believes that exports are the way for China to succeed. Now, that's exactly the opposite of what we want. And I think that essentially Xi Jinping is not going to give up on things that are central to the Communist Party. The suppression of consumer demand is, I think, central to China's system. So these conversations are going to be extremely difficult. We got to remember that in the last year of the Biden administration, the president sent so many cabinet officials to China to talk about the overcapacity problem. In other words, what we've just been discussing. And China was intransigent. People may say Trump's a better negotiator than Biden. I mean, the point is whether Trump's a better negotiator or not is probably not going to make much of a difference because Xi Jinping is going to be adamant.
To that point, even in our last conversation, you said that President Xi wants an economy relying on manufacturing, not the consumer. He doesn't want the consumer to be empowered. As this temporary agreement stands right now, is the consumer suppressed? Are they not empowered? What am I thinking if I'm a Chinese consumer right now?
Well, the Chinese consumer is in trouble because the Chinese economy looks like it's contracting. When we look at price data for February, March, and April, we can see the country's in a deflationary spiral because in April, the CPI was down for 3 straight months, and the producer price index, which measures factory gate prices, was down 31 straight months. And that means that I think Chinese consumers are just not in the mood to go out and buy for a number of reasons. First of all, a lot of them don't have employment. But more important, when you're in a deflationary spiral, even if you got all the money in the world, you just want to wait until things get cheaper. So Chinese consumers right now are not in a good place. And so I don't really see that we're going to be selling much in the way of consumer goods, or at least as much as we would like and as much as we expect.
I know that you didn't see a trade deal happening that would be based on rebalancing the Chinese economy. Does this new tariff rate, does this rebalance the Chinese economy?
No, it doesn't because essentially our goods are being kept out of China because of non-tariff barriers. But also, Brittany, it's just that at this point, Xi Jinping doesn't want us there, and we are seeing, I think, the signs of economic distress. So we aren't going to be selling very much or as much as we would like to the Chinese consumer. And I don't think this deal really helps us in any substantial way because it's the non-tariff barriers.
And it took a weekend in Switzerland between U.S. officials and Chinese officials to get this temporary tariff pause in place. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that neither side wanted to see a decoupling. So when you're looking at the bigger picture here, what do you think that this temporary agreement does between or for U.S. and Chinese relations?
Well, I think that's a really important question you asked because although the Treasury Secretary said that the United States doesn't want to see decoupling, I think that's exactly what the Trump administration wants. They want supply chains that are more resilient. They want manufacturing in the United States. And the only way you get there really is decoupling. So when I heard the Treasury Secretary said that, I sort of rolled my eyes. And of course, the Chinese don't want decoupling. They want us to remain dependent on factories in China. But that's just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen not only because Trump is pulling factories out of China, it's also Xi Jinping is pushing them out. So both push and pull, I think, go in the same direction in terms of decoupling.
I know you think that the United States wants to see decoupling. I mean, what happens if these two economies, the world's two biggest economies, are decoupled?
Um, well, what we're going to see is just trade flows redirected. We're starting to enter, the world is starting to enter into a period of deglobalization. It's going to take a little bit of time before it becomes clearer, but the signs are already there, which means that not only will be trading, I think, less, we're going to be trading with countries closer to us. So there'll be more trade in the Americas and less trade across the Pacific. This will take some time to become clear that this is happening, but in an era of turbulence, when the skies and the seas are no longer reliably safe, then companies are going to do what is rational, which is to shorten their supply chains. You know, supply chains stretched halfway around the world when there were no political barriers to trade. But now we're seeing those political barriers go up, and companies, of course, are going to react.
I want to read what President Trump posted on Truth Social regarding the talks. He said that they were a quote, total reset negotiated in a friendly but constructive manner. We want to see, for the good of both China and the U.S., an opening up of China to American business. You're a student of history here. Do you think that we will realistically see China open up to American business?
No, I really don't think so. You know, it was a point that if this were going to happen, it would have happened when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. But for various reasons, it didn't happen. And it's just because the communist system really is resistant to foreign business. And sometimes, you know, in the history of China, we have seen the regime open up, especially starting in 1978 with the beginning of the reform era, but not under Xi Jinping, who has a very different vision of China. His vision is much closer to 1950s China. His hero is Mao Zedong, and we are seeing Xi Jinping, I think, move China in that direction. He doesn't have the power to fully push China there, but that's where he can, and that where he does have the power, that's what he's doing. So I don't think that President Trump's vision for China is the same as Xi Jinping's.
If China is so resistant to foreign business, what then are you looking out for the next 90 days? Do you think that the United States can really have meaningful negotiations with China then?
Well, we'll have meaningful negotiations, but I don't think they're going to produce a meaningful result, especially not within 90 days. And I think that China will just try to delay. Remember, China, with 90 days, basically its export factories are going to be producing for Christmas. This is great for China. And it really relieves a lot of the pressure that we have seen on the export sector. But I think China is going to say, well, you know, at the end of the 90 days, we really need to have another 90 days. So I'm going to see, I see them trying to delay this. I don't know what Trump will do in terms of a request for another delay. He would just have to wait. But remember, on TikTok, we actually have something. On TikTok, Trump gave an extension on his first day in office, and then he extended the extension. And so probably Xi Jinping is thinking that he can TikTok the United States on the trade talks as well.
Do you think that the United States and the team negotiating for the United States, do you think they're missing anything when it comes to China that perhaps you have some knowledge on?
Well, no, they've got far more knowledge than I do. I have a very different outlook on China, and a very different view of where it's going. So, but I don't know any more than they do by any means, because they've been involved in these discussions for quite some time, and I'm just an outside observer.
What then, as an outside observer that has plenty of expertise in this area, are you looking out for in this 90-day period?
I'm actually looking to see what Apple will do. You know, it's very interesting that on the first of this month, Tim Cook said that during the current quarter, that most of the production of iPhones for the U.S. market will come from India. And he said the production for other devices, such as iPads, will come from Vietnam. That to me is really startling, because Apple has the most difficult to move supply chain. And if Apple can make that statement, then, basically anybody can move their supply chains. So I'll be watching what companies actually start to do during this 90 days. Because although, companies may say, well, look, the US and China are going to settle things, I don't think they are for the reasons we just discussed. And I think that companies are going to try to protect their supply chains by making sure they're not as reliant on China. Because if they do, if they still remain reliant on China, they could get to a point where they don't have a business because they can't bring products into the US. So, just as a matter of business necessity, we'll be looking at how companies rearranged their supply chains.
Is China concerned hearing that, hearing Apple saying we're moving our supply chains, thinking that other companies might take a cue from Apple and move their supply chains out of China? I mean, how big of a concern should that be for China?
Oh, I think China is very concerned about that. We've seen China try to do its best to keep Apple inside China. And there's a lot of turbulence now between Pakistan and India. I don't know, but I would just say this might not be a coincidence. We know that China has tried to tar India's image as a place for manufacturing. They've done that for years and years. Right now, I'm sure that people in Beijing are extremely concerned about Tim Cook's announcement.
Well, there is certainly a lot to look out for, especially in this 90-day temporary pause. And Gordon Chang, I always appreciate your perspective. I hope you can come back on and join me as we see more developments play out. Thank you so much for the time.
Well, thank you so much, Brittany. I really appreciate it.